Hello, everybody. Welcome to Nothing Exempt. My name is Brian Piotr, and I'm here with my co host Nicholas Pardini. There's something new about the way we're recording our sound today, and we would love your feedback. But getting on to the show, today's show is on the island of Cuba. Nick, lead us off.
All right, Cuba is a very interesting island. It has a checkered political history. It has a very unique culture, and uh, a lot of our listeners legally can't go there. So there's going to be a lot of fun with this show. But first, let's do some of the basics. Cuba is the biggest island in the Caribbean. It has about an area of about 42,400 square miles and a population of 11,200,000, which is basically unchanged from where it was 20 years ago. Uh, Cuba is one of the few pure communist countries left in the world. It is still mostly illegal to own private property or to private employment. Even though it has changed somewhat, at its peak, 91% of employment was government. Now it's down to about the high 70s% wise. But those are some of the initial facts. The word Cuba comes from the Taino language, but its exact derivation is unknown. And the native Taino were the first people to live in Cuba until the Spaniards came. And Cuba was one of the first places to be discovered in the Americas. In fact, Christopher Columbus himself went to Cuba in 1492, and he thought originally it was a peninsula off the coast of Southeast Asia, when in fact it was actually an island in the Caribbean. It's part of the reason why the island of the Caribbeans are called the West Indies, because a lot of people thought originally they were the East Indies, which is the old term for Indonesia. So that's some of the history. It was a Spanish colony for the next 400 years, from till the Spanish-American War in 1898, where the U.S. knocked Spain's final vestiges out of North America. And Cuba was briefly an American protectorate until it became its own independent country in about 1902, where it had a little bit of a volatile democracy until you had the Cuban Revolution in 1959. And since then, it has been a Soviet-aligned communist country until the Soviet Union fell in 91, and now it's just kind of a rogue state. We'll go more into some of the unique historical quirks later in this episode, but I just wanted to give people just a brief summary. And it's about geographically, it's in the Caribbean, it's 90 miles south of Key West, which is the southernmost point in the United States, which we did a previous whole island show on. And it's a very tropical climate, and they have a variety of different agriculture, and demographically, uh, it's a very ethnically diverse place. Most of the population is white of Spanish descent, but there's also a lot of mixed race people and blacks on the island too. And if you even 1% is Asian. So that's some of the initial comments on Cuba. So, Brian, what are your thoughts on Cuba before I go into more of the nitty gritty?
Well, backing you up to your very first comment, Nick, you said that it's illegal for us to go there, and that's just not true. If you want to visit Cuba, there are plenty of legal opportunities for you to do that. One of which is you can join the military and go to Guantanamo Bay in the Navy.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention Guantanamo Bay. It's this one little base on the southern coast of Cuba that's a U.S. sovereign base on an island that's historically, at least in the modern history, been one of America's biggest
So,
enemies.
so how did we end up with that base, Nick? Do you know?
It's a byproduct of the Spanish-American War.
It was part of the settlement of the Spanish American War. And will we have that base forever? I don't think so. I think that that's supposed to end after a 99-year lease. But
It's been
as,
well
as
more than 99 years since the Spanish-American War.
yeah, so that doesn't mean that we didn't make an agreement later than the end of the Spanish American War.
So, yeah, the other unique fact about, and it's still, yeah, if you're in the military, but Cuba generally, like if you want to go there, like as a tourist, it's not as straightforward as going to another country. It's mostly banned. And there's still a trade embargo between the U.S. and Cuba to this day. Barack Obama did some things to liberalize Cuban travel, but a lot of the workarounds that a lot of tourists are starting to use prior to the 2016 election were effectively reversed under President Trump.
Yeah, I looked it up. America doesn't have any agreement to actually leave. But in any case, if you look up flights to Cuba, you can purchase one right now. You may have a visa problem once you get there, but legally, you just go to a different country, get a visa there, then travel to Cuba, and then travel back, and don't tell the State Department about it. That's the
Oh yeah,
workaround.
I mean I know people who've done that. Like it's mostly of them are non-Americans, but
You
it's
say, I had a great week in Mexico, and you
yeah.
fly to Mexico City, then you get on a plane to Cuba, and then you fly back to Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Would you go to before we get more into the history and the cultural quirks of Cuba? Would you ever go to Cuba as long as the current government is in charge?
I don't have any interest in visiting that country with all the restrictions and difficulties involved. If those were lifted, even with the current government, if we had good relations where we exchanged prisoners and had the rule of law, then sure. Yeah, I'm on board with that. It's just, I don't want to deal with all the paperwork.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I want to go to Cuba as long as the current government is in charge. I really don't.
Yeah, but if
If
like
most
the
of the
next guy,
businesses there are owned by the Cuban military, by the fact that you are going to Cuba, it means you're basically financially supporting that regime.
right? But if they have a succession like the Chinese did that doesn't really lead to regime change, but opens up the economy in a way like never before, and it becomes virtually becomes a different place like China, then I'm on board with visiting it. I'm on board with going there with seed funding and starting a business in that scenario if they make it a lot safer to do that.
I just don't see that happening. Like, at least
As
for
far as the culture of the Caribbean, Cuba has a lot of culture, a lot of food, dancing, beautiful heritage, lots of things to sell to tourists, lots of great beaches, more water than surrounding islands, and so it's a little bit easier on the populace to be there. So it's got a ton of advantages over its island neighbors.
Yeah, so some other unique some what are some unique things about Cuba? For one, is since the U.S. embargo, they a lot of like the part places in Cuba, particularly in Havana, it still looks like relics of like an older era. Like you see like a lot of 1950s cars still on the road. I mean, they have modern hotels now in a lot of parts of Cuba because tourism opened up to non-Americans in the early 90s, but it still has a lot of these quirks. Another thing is that there's two different currencies on the island. There's the tourist currency, which is pegged to the U.S. dollar, and then they have the local currency, which is worth about 1/25th of the tourist currency for local transactions. It's mainly to prevent capital flight, is why that's designed that way. And Cuba also uh, has a lot of the ways people stay in Cuba is they stay at these houses which people rent out like a room in their house and make them breakfast in a way that's kind of like a hybrid between like an Airbnb and like a hotel. And it's one of the few businesses that a private individual can legally own in Cuba. But the fees to buy and maintain the licenses are expensive for Cuban standards.
Yeah. So, what are the current industries? What's it like? What's life like there? If you're not a tourist, if you just live in Cuba, what's the average day?
I mean, I think something our listeners would be really interested in, and you should put in the show notes, Brian, is videos on YouTube of what Cuba looked like prior to the revolution in '59. Because Cuba was probably well on its way back then to becoming a close, if not a developed country. They had a lot of they had a lot of money there, and especially in Havana, there were a lot of nice resorts. It was very popular among like casino goers, and they even had a AAA baseball team in the American minor leagues. Which in 1959, every team back then, which was a minor league AAA city, eventually had a Major League Baseball team. Their competitors were places like Montreal and Milwaukee and stuff like that, which didn't have teams at the time. And yeah, you could have had an alternative history where Cuba had a Major League Baseball team, the Havana Sugar Kings. But then the revolution happened, and one of the first things Fidel did was basically seize all American assets on the island outside of Guantanamo Bay. And America did the same thing with Cuban assets in the States. And on top of that, you've had 10% of Cuba's population migrate to the U.S. between 1959 and 1989. And a lot of them settled in South Florida and the Miami area, which kind of helps explain why the culture in South Florida is the way it is today. But today in Cuba, it's a very repressive place still. There's a lot of political prisoners. They have a surprisingly long life expectancy for a country of its income level. It's almost at the level of the US, actually. So I guess that's one thing they do have going for them. But outside of that, like almost everybody works for the government. Your wages and your resources are all divided equally, and you have ration cards for certain products that allow you to decide what you're allowed to have and what you're not allowed to have. It's if it's it, I guess like everybody I guess in theory is taken care of, but it's at a much lower standard of living, and their standard of living has failed to grow while it has in many other emerging parts of the world, especially emerging Asia and other Latin American countries such as Chile. So yeah, that's kind of generally what life is like in Cuba. I'm not an expert in the day to day life of somebody in Cuba, but they
You,
still
you
don't really.
know, Nick, as far as differences in level of income, I can't think of another place on earth that has such immediately and vast differences than the Caribbean. You have the Cayman Islands on one side of Cuba and the Bahamas on the other side of Cuba from the Cayman Islands,
Yeah, both of those have GDPs per capita double or more of Cuba.
right next to each other. And at the same time, you have Haiti and Dominican Republic, and the GDP per capita is much lower too. And then right next to that, you have Puerto Rico with a much higher GDP per capita for this being neighbors. You'd think based on resources, they all are similar. They have nice beaches. They can do the same thing with tourism. They have the same type of agricultural
No, but
land.
Cuba has better land or agriculture. You
Yeah,
can grow.
Cuba's got the most resources. So it's almost like there's no better place on earth to simply compare government styles and how that affects people's lives.
Well, and yeah, and then well, I mean, Southeast Asia is also another one where you see a lot of divergence between GDP per capita. But out
Well, like Singapore. But
Singapore versus Laos on the like one stream or the
but
other.
but it, no, in this instance though, they're all islands. They're all in similar locations. There's a lot of similarities, and I feel like it's a much more honest comparison of government styles versus standard of living.
Well, there's also different racial and demographic factors, and um, how the countries got independent or which ones are still part of Europe. So and getting supported by a benefactor. So it's not entirely that way, but yeah, I think it is an apt comparison. And Cuba should be doing a lot better. If Cuba was run by a more sound government, it probably would have become a first world country, especially given its proximity to the U.S. And I think part of the reason why Las Vegas became as big as it did was because of the Cuban Revolution. Because Cuba was the previous, maybe not in terms of like pure gambling, but it was the kind of the place you went to like get away from your normal life. And what happens in Cuba stayed in Cuba. I think was kind of the vibe of it before the revolution.
Yeah. So, is there anything else that we're missing as far as a section or an overview of Cuba that we should really go
Well, yeah, I
into?
can say more about Cuban culture. Like Cuba was very strategically important because it was the place where Hernan Cortez started his invasion of the Aztec Empire and really was the foothold generally for Latin American conquest for Spain, was at least until Mexico got fully established, like the as New Spain was like the capital of Latin America. Havana at one point was at like as late as the late 1700s was the third largest city in the Americas, or at least North America. And in terms of Cuban culture, they speak Spanish. It's still mostly a Catholic country, but religion is somewhat suppressed just given the nature of a Marxist government. Not as much as it used to be in the Soviet era, but there still are restrictions on freedom of religion and free association. And yeah, I mean, I wonder, and also given the success of like the Cuban diaspora in the U.S., that's also the baffling thing about Cuba. Like, what if Cuba was still like a free country? Do you think Bush would have won the presidency in 2000?
that, that's such a funny question. Is yeah, if Florida makes the difference in the vote, and we're not talking many votes, 50,000 votes, yeah, something as simple
It
as
was
this could
500
have.
votes in the 2000, I think, for Florida.
Yeah, it's very possible something like this could have changed the outcome. Now, here's the bigger question: is would a different president have done different things, or would we have the same thing? Like, would we basically have had the Bush presidency with a Democrat? The
But
Gore presidency, would they have invaded Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11? Probably. This the Pentagon is pushing for stuff.
yeah, but I mean, I think it would have been a lot harder because the neocons had a lot more influence in the Republican Party. The
Anyways, we're
Democrat.
getting a little far away. What's your favorite food in Cuba? Like when I go to a Cuban restaurant, I love the plantain chips that they make.
They
Like
have some
having
good
Cuban
meat dishes.
sandwiches.
I don't really know the name of them, but I mean, I've gone to a lot of good Cuban restaurants in Miami, and there's a decent one here in Orange County called Habana.
What would you eat at a Cuban restaurant, Nick? Sandwich?
Not really. I'd probably get some sort of meat dish,
Like?
like like a Cuban style, like steak or I don't really remember because I don't go to Cuban restaurants that often. Uh,
Okay. Yeah,
well,
well, I think the most notable thing if you go to like an American Cuban restaurant is that they all have plantain chips. That's like
yeah,
a signature mark that gets put in with everything else they're going to do. And they're good.
yeah. I mean, don't we're not the experts on Cuban food,
Oh,
so
no, we're not the experts on a lot of things, Nick. We're just talking about the island and I think that's fine.
I mean, I've enjoyed all the times I've gone to Cuban restaurants. I personally prefer other countries in Latin America's food, but it's still pretty good food.
Okay. And then the
Oh yeah,
other
the other
parts
thing,
are
Cuba's really big on baseball. You've seen a lot of defectors who get smuggled away from Cuba to Mexico or the United States, and from the Cuban national baseball team, and end up becoming like good players or superstars in Major League Baseball.
yeah, just like the Dominican Republic. They have a real advantage there when all the other kids play it and you get to play like consistently and you don't have to be hindered by things like homework and school and you can just play all day and the weather's always nice. You can play year round. You're in the
Yeah, but they
Caribbean.
don't have the resources. They have to help their struggling families in a lot of those countries. Like a lot of them, they even use like milk cartons for baseball gloves. Some of the poor communities on these islands.
Yeah, I agree. But they do have the advantages of being able to play all day in terms of weather and it's like the main sport. So all the kids are playing it. You get to play the best other kids, and you become really good. So we have fantastic players from the Caribbean in the Major League Baseball.
Yeah, Cuba, like as we mentioned before earlier show, could have had its own base Major League Baseball team if it didn't have the revolution. And the other legacy of Cuba is all the annoying people who wear Che Guevara shirts. You know, Che was not Cuban originally.
All right. Well, on that note, guys, please give us some feedback on what you thought of the new audio system. And if you want to go find us other places, please go to Nothing Exempt on either Reddit or Twitter and reach out to us. We'd love to have more suggestions on what islands you'd like to listen to and what else you'd like to have added, subtracted, or, just have a conversation with us.
Yeah, pending any change to listener feedback, I think our next island is going to be right next door to Cuba, and that's Hispaniola.
Oh, I see it. I didn't even realize it was an island or that island was there. Sorry. Who we'll have to wait till the next show and I'll have to do a little bit of research before we do it.
Yeah,
Anyways, this may or may not be our last show that we post before the Christmas holiday. So if we miss you, Merry Christmas, but if we don't, I'll wish you Merry Christmas on the next one. Thanks for another great year of Nothing Exempt, Nick.
all right, you too, Brian, and yeah, well, Merry Christmas to the audience. But I think we will probably do at least one more show before
Okay,
Christmas.
let's make that our goal. Okay, talk to you later.